Hey folks, George here again with another work of Japanese cinema this time that we're going to be discussing to really start discussing the 1970s in Japan. Today we're going to be discussing the controversial movie by Oshima Nagisa called In the Realm of the Senses. This movie is controversial for many reasons, the most obvious of which is that it's a portrayal of what today we might call hardcore pornography. Yeah, so much of the movie really is just hardcore pornography. During this video today, I will not be showing too much of that stuff, just out of notions of, decorum, let's say. And I don't think actually showing the images here is necessary to make the points that I'm trying to make today. Obviously, as always, just because it's a movie, we can still talk about all the 8 points that I usually talk about regarding literature. The first of which, characters, then setting, plot, and themes. And also, we'll talk about the text itself. In this case, the text is a movie and a moving image. So we'll talk about the text and how that affects different things. Also, the history, we will talk about intertextual connections. And finally, myself and how I feel about this movie and what sort of connections I personally have with this movie. What is interesting is that Oshima chose for his characters the actual historical figure of Abe Sada, who is famous, of course, for being working in a brothel and severing the penis and killing one of her lovers. Why would somebody in 1976 make a movie about something that happened in 1936? 1936 is an interesting year, isn't it? Because I think previously I've spoken about Mishima Yukio's short story and short film called Patriotism. That film and short story discussed a historical event from 1936. 1936, a very interesting year in Japanese history, especially in the lead up to World War II and other things. I think we will talk a little bit about World War II in this movie too, or in this discussion too. So as we talk about the characters, I think let's talk about the historical elements of the characters and things like that. We'll jump ahead to history first and then see how Oshima decides to focus on certain elements, not other elements, right? How does Oshima decide to tell this story? Because after all, in 1976, he's making a movie in 1976, probably about 1976. So what can we learn about the history of 1936, 40 years earlier, that might help us understand a little bit better this film that was released in 1976? Well, let's go back to the history in 1936 Japan. We are in this interwar era. What is interesting is that Oshima only really has one shot in this movie where he reveals the era of 1936. We'll talk a little bit about this regarding setting too. Yeah, history, setting, and characters are all going to tie in very closely together in this discussion. They're all very much entangled because this is a work that is taking a historical story and reframing it as a movie. So what was Japan like in 1936? Well, I discussed this a little bit, this interwar period and this lead up to World War II period in some previous videos, especially the video about Tanazaki's essay In Praise of Shadows, and also the video about Mishima Yukio's short story Patriotism. We see this build-up towards imperialism. Well, indeed, by 1936, Japan was already very much in the throes of its imperial role, trying to take over other parts of Asia, especially in imperialist expansion into other parts of Asia, including Korea, including China, and which would extend into Southeast Asia as well. But in this movie, we only see one shot where we get any glimpse of this imperialistic Japan. And this is a shot where the male protagonist, the male main character in the movie, Kichizo, where Kichizo is walking to the brothel, presumably, and he passes a marching troop of soldiers who are brandishing the imperialist flag. Why does he do that? Well, number one, it's to show, I think, because it's only one shot in the whole film that even references this period. Why does he squeeze in that shot where in the rest of the movie there's so much just pornography? Why not just keep putting in more pornography and more sex and more genitalia and taboo sorts of sex too? We'll talk about taboos in a bit. I think it is to show that the nature of pornography and the nature of sex and the nature of the body, all themes that we're going to talk about in a bit, are very political in nature. This is a political movie. We can look at this movie through a political lens. For that matter, I'm wondering if we could extend that and suggest that we could look at much of pornography through a political lens, right? That'll give us some sort of food for thought, that pornography is political in nature, as opposed to what the United States Supreme Court has called prurient in nature. Well, it seems to me that Oshima, by squeezing in that shot, is trying to say this is a political work. I am trying to make a political statement via pornography, via the historical knowledge, the historical memories that we have of 1936 and imperialist Japan. By the way, I didn't forget that this is in the throes of imperialist Japan. Here's your shot. And that helps us contextualize and go, so is this a political film? Well, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to look at it through that political lens. So what happens in this film and what happened in the history of this event? So who was Abe Sada? As I've already stated, she was a prostitute, and Kichizo was ultimately her John, whom she falls in love with, or lust, or something. She becomes infatuated with him, and she ultimately severs his penis and killed him. What's interesting is that Oshima clearly knows this history in 1936, as I believe many Japanese are aware of this incident, because it was a famous incident, made all the headlines and stuff like that. When I was a child in the 90s, I recall the Lorena Bobbitt incident. Now, if you are as old as I am, all I have to do is say Lorena Bobbitt, and I think the memory will come back of who she was and what she did. I'm not going to go into that right now just yet. So she severs his penis, and Oshima, despite the fact that he knows, and many Japanese folks know who she is, at the end he gives us information that closes the film that she walked around for 4 days with his severed penis until she was caught by the authorities and, of course, tried and convicted. And, of course, this trial was crime of the century type of stuff that was very popular and known to many people. However, let's jump forward to 1976 and the history of 1976 for a second. Why does Oshima have to wrap up the story and tell us what happened? Well, it so happens that Oshima, the filmmaker, is not making this film necessarily for the Japanese audience. He is intending this film for wider international distribution. He is making this film for the international audience. He knows that in 1976, my goodness, look at censorship in Japan. We have to censor our pornography, unlike the West. What a shameful position it is for us Japanese to have to censor our pornography. So it's an interesting sort of vision that he's got, that he's looking at the West as an ideal in terms of free speech, in terms of anti-censorship. And in order to do that, he wants to kind of say, and he's said in places before, that he wanted to make a pornography to show that Japanese can make pornography just like the West. However, because of censorship laws, he has to do all kinds of interesting skirting things to skirt the law, the Japanese law, that is. So, yeah, the internationalness of this film is quite fascinating. What do I mean by that? Well, in 1976, how did he get this film made? He couldn't get it made totally in Japan, right? Or only in Japan, at least. Number one, he had to buy the film from France. He couldn't buy Japanese film. He just in order to get around censorship laws. And this is what I love about government and government impositions on things. Smart people, artists, know how to get around laws in interesting ways. I love that. I love that. You could probably tell a little bit more of my political leanings when I suggest that I think that people or smarter individuals are smarter than government. When a government passes a law, smart people will know how to get around it in interesting ways. And Oshima does that. Oshima says, well, in order to get around the censorship laws, I'm going to go to France, or rather buy film from France, the film stock, have them ship it here to Japan. I'll shoot the movie here in Japan, but then I won't edit or develop the film. This is the old days, of course, before digital technology, so you actually had to get rolls of film. In order to develop that film, he sent it all the way back to France to develop. And the film was developed in France, and the film was edited in France. And of course, when it was brought back to Japan, he created a censored sort of version where a lot of the genitalia and hardcore pornography was blurred and edited in certain ways. However, he did release an international version which was less censored and uncensored. Today we could watch this hardcore pornographic version. And I really like how this reveals to us a little bit about the history of 1976 Japan and around censorship. Trying to say, and how other people, even in Japan, Oshima, are thinking about censorship and saying, wait a second, don't we want to show that we shouldn't censor things? And this is, again, in my interpretation, a political film saying, let me show you what I think about your censorship laws, government of Japan. And that, to me, is fascinating and shows so much awesome artistry and creativity on the part of the filmmaker. Let's jump back in history a little bit right now. Let's go back to the 1930s and censorship in the 30s. So certainly all countries, even here in America, where, the land of free speech, we all experience censorship in some form or another, right? Now, many of us say we are anti-censorship, free speech. However, in America, I don't want to get into this too much, but even in America, child pornography is censored by the government and banned. And if you possess, or create child pornography, you will be imprisoned, right? So there is censorship. Now, I don't want to get into the debates about should this be censored and why do we censor certain things but not others. But I do want to say that censorship as a rule, especially for those of us who think that child pornography should continue to be censored, I want us to acknowledge that, yes, there is a role for censoring certain things, or that there are things that are censored sometimes. Now, do some jurisdictions censor more things than should be? Yeah, I think that's a fair room for debate that I don't want to have right now. I don't want to have that debate right now, but I think it is rife for a serious discussion. If you want to consider it, please, think about that. Should things be censored? How should we draw the line between what is censored and what isn't? Back in the 1930s in Japan, of course, we are in the throes, I've mentioned already, of imperialist Japan. And in imperialist Japan, there was protests against the government, which was very right-wing in nature. And some writers were, of course, censored. One of the more famous communist or left-wing writers who was censored is Kobayashi Takiji. Now, the story about Kobayashi Takiji is that he was arrested under censorship laws for violating censorship laws and killed in custody in Japan for speaking out and spreading communist values. What does that say? Well, it so happens that in 1936, when Sada is captured and put on trial and imprisoned, she's imprisoned for only 6 years. Let's compare Abe Sada's case to other feminist writers in Japan, female feminist writers who wrote about things like equality and spoke out for equality. I'm thinking primarily of Kanno Sugako, who was executed for being a feminist and being a political agitator. Those two cases, the case of Kobayashi Takiji and Kanno Sugako, might reveal to us a little bit of the Japanese government's attitude regarding censorship in and during that imperialist regime of that interwar period, or even in Kanno's case in that late Meiji era, and how they felt about free speech, political speech, and things like that. I think in a previous discussion like this, I've also talked about Kishida Toshiko, who was imprisoned for her political speech. Here, Oshima is in 1976, and his flavor of political speech is hardcore pornography. And how can we use how does he use hardcore pornography to make political statements about the nature of Japan? Well, let's talk about Japan in the 1970s for a quick second. It is clear that by the 1970s, Japan has experienced this economic miracle, right? I've discussed it a little bit during my discussion of Mishima Yukio's patriotism, how in post-war Japan, given the support by the United States, Japan really maximizes industry and a lot of things like that in order to experience an economic boom like no other. Also talked about the protests that happened in the 60s, that this economic boom sort of leaves behind so many people. However, around 1970, the protests really fall off in Japan, and everybody just seemingly comes to accept that this is the way things are. Protests stop, and people simply accept, well, this is Japan. We are in this economic boom. Everybody's got a refrigerator, a car, and a television. So what do we have to worry about now? What are we really protesting about? We're all rich, so to speak. In the 70s, Japan seemed very rich, and people were happy, and people were at least complacent with the challenges that existed. Well, except for a few artists, right? In the future, I'll discuss Murakami Haruki and his literary works. I think he says something, of course, I'm not quoting him directly here, but he says something like, yeah, it's so funny that right after the 60s, right after 1970, and by the way, what happens in 1970? Mishima commits suicide, for one thing. The interesting thing that happens is the Osaka World Expo that happens in 1970. And it really is this sort of, hey, we're going to stop protesting. And Murakami comments later, I don't have the quote exactly, that all of us protesters in the 60s, once 1970 happened, we all put on shirt and ties and just went to work and stopped protesting. And so within that context, we have this film by Oshima, who is pushing the lines a little bit, right? Who is trying to push back and say, wait a second, I think that we should remember all of what happened before. We shouldn't be so complacent and resigned to this status quo. Shouldn't we push back a little bit? Well, he pushes back via hardcore pornography. He pushes back, however, against censorship and free speech. This is despite the fact that in 1945, the Japanese Constitution says censorship of any kind shall not be permitted. Well, that's a confusing sort of and vague statement, isn't it? Well, for example, I just explained earlier, many of us are against censorship, myself included. I love free speech. However, one thing I don't like is child pornography. I am okay with censoring certain things. So what does this 1945 Constitution, the 1945 Japanese Constitution, mean when it says censorship shall not be permitted? Political censorship? Well, isn't that interesting? Because then what is political and what isn't political? And Oshima, I feel like in this film, in the realm of the senses, is pushing that line and saying, I could be political through something which you've called prurient, through sex. Isn't sex very political? And I think that's where Oshima is pushing back quite a bit. Another thing that's interesting about 1970s Japan and even 1960s Japan is the rise of television. Why is that so interesting? Well, because the rise of television meant the demise of cinema, right? Or movies. How can movies, if I could sit at home and watch movies for free on television and be entertained at home with this talking box in my living room, what do I need to go out to the movies for? So the movie industry declines precipitously in Japan, but also in America as well. Well, how do you respond? How does the movie industry respond? Well, one way that the Japanese movie industry responded is through the rise of pink films, which are pornographic films. Pornographic films were on the rise in Japan since 1962 or so. Is in the realm of the senses in that pink film genre? Well, some of those pink films are, very exploitative, very just throwaway sorts of movies. They are really speaking to the prurient interests. Is Oshima's film really speaking to our prurient interests? I think it's hard to deny that it is. Right? Of course, I've seen some, if you've watched the movie, you see some of these very explicit scenes in there that many people will get sexually aroused by, obviously. But I think Oshima is trying to say, wait a second, we could take what some people might call trash or low art, no art sort of films, and I could take that and elevate it, right? We can elevate this low art to a higher status. And I think that's going to be very interesting, a very interesting approach to this sort of thing. By the way, there were other sorts of attempts at this, even in America. I think Gore Vidal wrote a screenplay for a movie called Caligula. And Gore Vidal, a man of high letters in American literary scene in the 70s and late part of the 20th century as well. So we see that many artistic and high, what some people would call high art thinkers, are looking at pornography as an avenue to say, wait a second, this might be an avenue to explore high art. And by the way, talking about high art, whatever that means, even in Western art, when I take an art history class, don't I see so many nudes in that art history class? So there is, it seems to me, this very fine line between pornographic and art. And how to draw that line, I think, is darn near impossible. And Oshima is really trying to take that to the next level in a fascinating way. And one last thing about child pornography even is the fact that we see naked children playing in this movie. Isn't there an odd sort of feature in this movie of these naked children running around and doing their thing? Is that child pornography? That is a discussion that is worth having. And that is a debate that is worth engaging in. What do we mean by child pornography, and what do we mean by things that should be censored versus things that shouldn't be censored? Because these lines are very vague, to say the least, and very debatable. How about we talk a little bit more now about Sada and Kichizo as they are portrayed by Oshima in the film, in the realm of the senses. One thing that's very fascinating here is that Sada is clearly the figure and the center and the embodiment of desire in sex, regarding sexual desire, regarding sexual lust in this film. She's also the center and the focus of the violent actor in this film. She is the murderer, after all. Why is it that Oshima, or what might Oshima be trying to express by making Sada, the female character, the embodiment of, one, sexual desire, but also the embodiment, two, of violence and violent desire? I find that to be a very fascinating question right here. One thing that might be considered is, especially in light of the pre-war Japanese system, going back, a little bit back to history now, where the male was the head of the household. And there was this family state of Imperial Japan, at the top of which the male played the prominent role. After the defeat of the Imperial Japanese system, don't we also have a defeat of all of the ideology, and including the sex roles, the ideological sex roles that Imperial Japan dictated? And so I think that Oshima is suggesting that, look at this, pre-1945 Japan was wrong in so many ways. In so many ways. Pre-1945, pre-war Japan was wrong. One way that pre-war Japan might be wrong, Oshima might be saying, is in its dictations regarding sex roles. Can't a female be the embodiment of sexual desire? Why deny that? Females do have sexual desire. Females can be violent. And perhaps it's the males who should back off of their violence a little bit. In this way, can we say that Oshima's film is, at least in this way, feminist? That he is flipping the sexual roles and the gender roles in this film. How shocking it is, both in 1936 Japan and in 1976, to see the woman be the embodiment of violence, the woman as murderer, and the woman as sexually dominant. In so many of the portrayals of sex in this movie, we see Sada taking the dominant sexual position and taking control of the situation. She's the one who strangles him in their violent sexual behaviors. And we see Kichizo as the passive figure, the male being the passive figure in this movie. I think Oshima is asking us to question so many of our ideas about sex and gender roles, not just in Japan, but everywhere. Let's talk a little bit about the setting of this film. Now, clearly, this film is a historical work in which 1936 Japan is the obvious setting. However, what's interesting about this is very similar, in my interpretation. It's very similar to Mishima's short story Patriotism, such that in Patriotism, the whole setting, the whole story was confined to the inside of their home in Mishima's Patriotism. Well, here, we do get outside of the brothel, but only very little. There are very few scenes where we get outside of the brothel in this film. What does that say? Well, number one, I think that Oshima is also asking us to question this notion of privacy and voyeurism, and what is the realm of the private and what is the realm of the voyeur. Because I think he makes it very clear, in fact, in so many scenes in this film, when the two characters, Sada and Kichizo, are having sex in front of other people, and with other people watching. And what does that say about the limits and the boundaries of privacy, or the limits and the boundaries of sex and the privacy of sex? Well, I think Oshima is asking us to question some of these things. But what is even more interesting is when we do get outside of the brothel, the handful of scenes, the handful of shots that are outside of the brothel seem quite different, radically different. Well, I've already mentioned that one of those handful of scenes that are outside of the brothel, we actually see the Japanese imperial soldiers marching through town. Similar to what I had said previously in the patriotism discussion. I think that Oshima is saying that there is a difference between outside, normal Japan, normal life, versus inside, where we have a little bit more control. And isn't inside a more special place, and maybe even a more honest place, and outside, where we see these imperial soldiers who, by the way, We, with 2020 hindsight, of course, can say, those people did bad things. Isn't Oshima saying something similar to my interpretation of Mishima, when the inside is sacred, the home is sacred? It's the outside that's chaotic. Furthermore, the other kinds of outside exterior scenes, exterior shots of this film, outside of the brothel, are when Sada is with her other John. One discussion in particular, she asks, hey, can I be with you a little bit more? And what does the other John say? Oh, absolutely not. I've got my reputation to think about. And that to me is a fascinating scene, because isn't Oshima Bai saying that? And if we compare it with the setting and with everything else that I've been talking about so far, isn't Oshima saying that outside is lies? Normal world is full of lies. This John, who is participating in prostitution, who in privacy will have sex with Sada all he wants. But once we get outside, no, I'm a good man outside. Isn't that a bit double-faced of him? And isn't that what Oshima might be saying about outside world? And not just the outside world, but all of and much of 1970s Japan. That outside we put on one face, but inside we are different people. We care about reputation, and we put on a phony face, a lie. Well, under my interpretation, I am kind of going in this direction, and like I said, I find it quite fascinating that one of my previous discussions about Mishima's patriotism expresses similar sort of sentiments, it seems, at least under my interpretation. So for that reason, I think it is interesting that the setting is so interesting. Therefore, what are some of the themes that Oshima is asking us to consider while watching in the realm of the senses? Well, obviously, we could talk about sex, and that's going to be the obvious one that comes right to the forefront, since most of the plot, and by the way, the plot is so thin. What is the plot of this movie? Well, a couple meets, has a lot of sex, and then at the end, she kills him. And there isn't much more than that. But through that very simple plot, he examines so many things, doesn't he? And one theme obviously being the body, right? So many times in the movie, they talk about the body and they use their own bodies as instruments of pleasure, as the vehicle of pleasure. I also have already expressed this notion of the body as the focus and as the center of sexual desire, which of course in polite society is supposed to be suppressed in certain ways and kept private. And that's where this is connected with the setting and how inside we get the true nature of the body, and outside people lie about the body and what their body is really like and what their body really is. The body is an interesting sort of idea to explore. Why? Because it seems like these post-war artists are looking at the body as something different, as something primal, as something pre-culture, not poisoned by society. What does the body want before society tells it what to want? Well, it seems like water, food, and sex. Now, in polite society, we can talk about water and food a lot, and air, I suppose, too, right? But sex is that thing that so few people talk about regarding the primal urges. This is before culture. What the body really is and what we really are. Why would you challenge culture? Well, like I said, in this post-war era, people are reflecting. Oshima, I believe, is reflecting on what culture did to Japan and what they were told by the dominant cultural authorities, namely the government, namely the state, imperialist Japan. And they're telling them about all these things that they should want. And isn't that what's interesting about this post-70s period, where there is an increased affluence, increased riches. And people are telling you what you want. Culture is telling you what you want. But let's return to what the basics of the body are and what we want before as something primal, as something pure. Isn't sex, despite what so many of our cultural taboos tell us, isn't sex pure? After all, so many people want it. We all want it, just like we want food. What's wrong with wanting food? So in the same way, what's wrong with wanting sex? And isn't Oshima pushing forward that sort of, or at least reminding us of the basics, bare fundamentals about what we are? I am this thing, right? And even down a little bit further too, by the way. That's what I feel like Oshima's pornography is trying to express in a more political way. And isn't that a political message? By saying, what's wrong with sex? What's wrong with desire? What's wrong with telling other people? Why does society and culture tell us and tell other people, protect sex? Sex is private. Oshima is asking us to question all of our cultural taboos and recognize that we all have this thing and that stuff down there too. And isn't that natural? What's wrong with that? It's primal. It's there before culture. And that's why the body is going to be such an important theme for so many artists and creative thinkers in the post-war era, especially when we are questioning the very nature of what our dominant culture has dictated to us so much before. Now, I do think that it is always appropriate to talk about how this film affected me and made me feel. Without question, at the end of the film, I squirmed a little bit, right? There's one just very still shot that holds for quite a while of Sada laying over Kichizo's dead body, mutilated down there. Yeah, I'm sorry, that made me squirm. Why does this stuff make me squirm? Well, probably because, back to this question about body, aren't our sexual desires so core to what we are? And isn't the violation of sexual mores, and not just sexual mores, but the violation of my own sexual desires and the violation of my own sexual limits, isn't that going to be a complicated question, and a question that does make many of us squirm, and that makes many of us feel quite violated in the core of ourselves when those limits, those lines about this thing are crossed? And I think that's why these sorts of issues are so personal to so many of us. Now, I think it would be intellectually irresponsible to ignore some of the more problematic images, or at least problematic to me, images and sequences in this film. I've already discussed the children running around. Is that child pornography? Yes or no? But one of the more problematic sequences in this film is what, in my eyes, from my perspective, I would call rape. And that the girl did not enjoy and did not choose to participate in this activity, where she's violated with foreign objects as well, not just with human bodies, but with other objects. How can we make sense of this? How can we, viewers, interpret what Oshima is trying to do, who's asking us to flip our ideas of what taboo is, of what culture is trying to teach us, of what culture is trying to force upon us? I'm not sure. I really don't know. What do you all think? What is the role of rape and violence in this movie? It's one thing, I believe, the violence between Sada and Kichizo, because they are willing participants in this violence. But how are we to look at the violence that Sada inflicts upon others who are not willing participants? Well, one way to consider this might be that, of course, in a world where culture has told you and other people have told you, her other Johns who say, I can't have people know who I'm with. I can't have people know that I'm with you because otherwise I'd have to shoot myself in the head. In a culture like that, doesn't it drive certain people crazy? Wouldn't it drive people crazy to lose their minds? And might that be what Oshima is saying about Sada? That she is driven insane. Not just by Kichizo, but by society in general. And that insanity, of course, creates a monster. And might that help us consider for a second how we look at moral monsters? That person's a monster. I can't believe she would do that. Such an evil action. I'm not going to deny that these actions are evil. But what I think Oshima might be asking us is not to deny that the action is evil, but rather, what is the root cause of this evil? Is it all within Sada herself? Or might it be that society drives people towards evil actions? I don't know. How do you like that argument? Are you buying what I'm trying to sell here? We've heard that argument elsewhere, haven't we? Regarding other sorts of issues. How strongly do we feel about that argument? I don't know. And how much might we consider that argument when evaluating so-called evil in society next to us? Or evil in our own community? I think it is something that should at least be discussed and debated, even if you do disagree with that argument. How do we respond to it? What about some of the other intertextual connections that this film has? I've already talked about Mishima's short story and short film Patriotism, and how those seem to really examine very similar themes. Certainly sex, they both talk about, certainly this difference between private space versus outdoor space or exterior settings. But one thing that pornography in general raises, especially pornography in Japan, raises in my psyche is Tokugawa era shunga art and shunga prints. It's been argued by Oshima himself, in fact, that these shunga prints show and to some extent prove that these 20th century laws and these 20th century censorship laws prove or illustrate that such censorship is foreign to Japanese culture. After all, take a look at these prints, and these prints were enjoyed by the commoner classes during the Edo era in pre-modern Japan. However, I think that's an oversimplistic kind of argument for one reason, that while indeed many of these prints proliferate, and we have many of these prints today even, I think it's going to be an oversimplistic argument because after all, there were the power class, the shogunate, who did try to censor these prints. So it seems a lot more complicated to simply say clearly early Japan favored these sexual works. After all, previous video I made regarding Tale of Genji, we see all sorts of innuendo when they talk about sex. They never say these two characters had sex, right? So there is also a long tradition of, do we want to call it censoring, or going around not saying it quite so explicitly. So it is a bit complicated in that manner, despite the fact that indeed there are plenty of these shunga prints that illustrate the notion and the fact that sexuality was widely portrayed in the arts in pre-modern Japan. Why is it that sexuality is such an interesting topic for us? Like I just said, all the way back 1,000 years ago, in Tale of Genji. We see during the Heian era that sex plays such a prominent role in the magic of that work. Why is it such a core part? And not only that, but also an attractive part for us to view in terms of art, not just in Japan, but in so many places around the world. Well, perhaps it is this core part of our being, given that we are in this thing called a body that has sexual desires. And in many places, there are sexual mores and sexual rules and sexual taboos that are going to try to suppress certain things around that. And by the way, I do think that there are certain roles for sexual suppression, right? I don't want to get into that too much right now, but where those lines shall be drawn, I've already discussed child pornography, right? And having sex with children, I think many people would say that there's a line that should not be crossed. At least I am willing to go in that direction. So clearly we should have certain rules about sex, but where to draw those rules? And even today in New York City, we see many people, and in America, we see many people talking about gender roles and sexual roles and this push for sexual freedom. And while I'm not going to doubt, or I'm not going to question, and I'm not going to go against the notion that we should expand sexual freedom in many ways, I think there is going to always be this push and pull between, well, what might be appropriate versus what might not be appropriate sexual behavior. That opens up a whole huge can of worms that I might talk about in the future. But for now, we'll just leave it at that, because I think we've talked about a whole lot of interesting sexual stuff already. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.